Welcome, Stu.
Thank you.
Stuart Carr, ladies and gentlemen. I am so excited to actually have you on. So what happened was, I just want to give context to the man that I'm going to be chatting to today. And Stuart is a good friend. We connected in a group called Mankind Project. And in hearing Stuart's story, I have absolutely been in awe of the man, because he's someone that you're gonna tell me exactly, because I got the impression, I think even in the post that I put out, that it's like 20 to 30 years financially free. Could you correct me? How many years?
Well, I stopped working for other people when I was 43. So that was 24 years ago. 24
years ago. So Stu has an amazing story of and I think, okay, so what sparked this whole conversation, just to go back, because usually I don't even start these things off like how most people do. They have a plan and stuff, and I'm just sort of kind of naturally sort of flowing into this, and I'm not assuming, but I know the structure will come in place as I grow within this, but I thought I needed to get in and pick your brain, because the way you think is very different to how a lot of us are taught out there. And I just wanted to ask you a whole bunch more questions. We met earlier last week, and in that conversation, you shared some things with me that just made me sit and think about how I'm managing my money, and how, I mean, we're in a world now where things are so fast. Everything's fast. Communication's fast, and we're kind of in this. It's not delayed gratification. We want instant gratification today, and I'm part of that world, massive part of it. I want, grow a business, even though I want it now. I know that things take time and process, and your story was a big part of that. And I just wanted to connect with you, and thank you for being on here, and just connect with you around some of the secrets that you used to just get to where you are today. I mean, 23 years financially free. Firstly, what is that like?
Well, it's my dream come true. So you have to have a very strong motivation inside you, and that comes from various places. So my family, generally speaking, were quite poor, and I could see poverty around me. And I went to boarding school when I was 9, and because that meant that I no longer lived with my parents, I realized I was on my own at a very early age. And in the boarding school, I was exposed to people who had wealth. And then when I went home, was exposed to people who didn't have wealth. And I decided at a very young age that I wanted to be on the wealth side. But a lot of the wealth that exists in the boarding school from the people was inherited wealth. In other words, they were often farmers' sons. So they came from a class of people who had wealth in their family. So I left school when I was 18, and for various reasons I couldn't get into university. So I made a plan then, based on my analysis as a teenager, that I would have 3 properties, and I would live in one and rent out 2.
Okay, wait, hold on, stop. So there's a mindset there that I think is like already different, because I too have family that and came from an environment that was not conducive for wealth. Let's just put it like that. And luckily, my parents already had a very high expectancy around their life to shift them and move them out of that environment and move us out of that environment so that we could have a wealthier consciousness.
Right.
I mean, you were talking about the drivers there. What could you identify like what those were, besides the fact that you didn't want your surroundings?
Well, it was also, I didn't want to live in poverty, because there you get violence and you get early death and you get misery. and you get alcoholism and prostitution and drugs, and who wants to live like that? So the horrible side of being poor is that it drives you to dark places, and I didn't want to be in that. Plus, the deal my father made with me was that he would give me this education, but it meant I would no longer be with the family, and that included my cousins and whatever. So I learned early on that I had to be on my own. The school I went to was quite Spartan, so you have to be able to survive. So I knew early on I couldn't rely on anyone else, and therefore I had to come up with my own plan. A lot of my friends who were leaving school at 18, a lot of them, not all of them, had a place to go to. So they might go to the farm, or they might go to the business. They already had wealth that they were walking into. So for me, I had to create that wealth from kind of zero.
So where is this?
This is in the north of England, in Newcastle. That's where I was born.
Awesome.
Right, and it's an interesting part of the world. I've visited it a few times recently, but I think it's interesting because I was prepared to leave my family, prepared to leave the country I was in, prepared to leave my friends in order to find my wealth. And in the end, I ended up in South Africa because I believed that that's where I would earn more money. But I never walked away from the wealth that I created in England. So I've still got properties in England which I rent out.
Wow.
And I've still got my pension in England which I contributed to for 35 years.
Wow.
So when I came to South Africa in the 80s, whatever I'd created, which was small at the time because there was a lot of debt, I didn't have the money to buy the properties, I had to go into debt. They were chugging along very slowly, and people were paying rent, and over 25 years the payment of those rent basically paid off the properties. We changed a couple of the properties and sold and acquired other ones, but at the end of the day other people's rent paid off the properties that belonged to me and my family.
Wow. So so it was property, but that's not all your wealth, or how you accumulated it, is it?
No. What happened was, because it was the only way I didn't understand the stock market and I didn't understand business, but I did understand property because we lived in property. So my first attempt at becoming financially independent was property, because that's all I could see and touch. The stock market came along later when I learned. I worked for some companies up until I was 43, and during that time I was exposed to shares. So I was in charge of administrating pension funds and provident funds, and in order to do a pension and provident fund you have to do investments, and you invest in cash, you invest in property, you invest in bonds, but you also invest in shares. So then I got exposed to presentations about shares, and the light went on, a bulb went ding, and I went, wow, if I could get invested in shares, that would have helped me in my quest to become financially independent.
So I want to take a step back. So you come to South Africa in the 80s. At that point in time, because there's an element of your story that we talk about, there was like the shift of environmental change that you encountered. One when you're in England, then the next when you're here in the 80s, and then you've been here throughout the transformation of South Africa. Could you speak to that?
So I looked for privilege in the world, and in South Africa privilege existed for someone who was white, who had qualifications. So I followed that, and I'm unashamed of that, because that's what I was chasing. And because in order to get qualifications I had to go to night school, so I didn't have professional qualifications.
Right, because you left school.
Right, and South Africa wouldn't accept me.
Right.
Without some sort of qualification. So I studied at night school. So I had my properties going on, and then I was doing night school work, And it took me around about 5 years to get a professional qualification. 3 years of study and then 2 years of practical.
And obviously working during the day.
Yeah. So you have to put in that effort, and it takes up a lot of your time. But when you've got a drive towards, for me, not to be rich, I've got to say I don't particularly want to be rich. I want to be independent. So in order to be independent, you have to have money. So they're all linked, but wealth in terms of material things isn't really that important to me. But not having to work is a great gift, because then you're free. You're no longer a slave to a company, or a slave to the banks that you owe money to, or a slave because you have to work until you're 65 before you can retire. And I hated being enslaved. So South Africa provided me with an opportunity for a certain number of years. But at some point, BEE came in and everyone went, you're no longer privileged. You're white and therefore you're out of favor. And that was good. That wasn't bad for me. That meant I got to kick up the pants to become independent. So I am really happy about BEE. For my sake, for my own personal development, BEE was brilliant.
That's awesome. I mean, okay, so there's a lot of, I think there's so much in that. And in my last podcast with another friend, Craig, I mean, we talk about a little bit of our perception and then creating the life that one would love to have, regardless of the circumstances that are placed in front of us.
Right.
And it's funny, like you demonstrate those qualities. You demonstrate the quality of like having this vision and then acting towards that vision, regardless of what's happening in front of you. I mean, it's very easy at the stage first of all, to leave the UK and come here. That's a massive move. That's massive. I mean, for most people, they do not leave their province. And the mindset shift is huge. And secondly, but obviously you're younger and you're adventurous, so you want to take that. You're willing to take that step. Then the next thing is like, oh, circumstances may be good here, but or better here, but how do I then get over there? Because over here, from where I am, I can't reach there. I don't have the certain resources that are not available to me, and making that jump. Now, what I want to speak to is, in that jump, there's certain, you still had certain habits that you had to do in order to, because what happens most people that have high paying jobs, they tend to have a high amount of debt.
Yes.
Because I've worked for it, I deserve it, etc. As you're talking about the material stuff, how did you manage to? You're talking to your drive and stuff, but I mean, what were you doing during that time?
So the whole idea of debt is very interesting, and you're quite right. It's very easy when you've got a high salary to get high debt. So in that circumstance, when I was in my 20s and early 30s. People were offering me the ability to go overdrawn, but I decided not to, because I see debt, personal debt, as a trap. There's good debt. I mean, debt for a house is good debt, because you hope that housing prices will go up, hopefully ahead of inflation, and therefore your debt correspondingly reduces proportionately. So that sort of debt I had against properties. But for instance, the debt against cars, I refused to take on. So when the companies were offering me their golden handcuffs of get a new car, we'll give you the money to, I said no. And although they objected to that a little bit, because they wanted their people to drive around in shiny cars as part of their executive team. Yeah. And my car wasn't very shiny because it was quite old. Yeah. But the money they gave me, I saved, and then I ended up buying a car for cash. So my debt on cars became zero in my 30s. And suddenly removing that debt removed a roughly 30% of what I was paying out in debt to keep my lifestyle going. And the additional debt I had was against the property. So I used that additional income now that I had, when I was no longer paying for a car, to pay off my property. So by the time I was 37, which was 11, well, let's think, not 11, 9 years after I arrived in South Africa, because I arrived when I was 28, I paid off my house. And it took me those 9 years to pay it off. So now I had zero debt. And I had a car I was driving and a house in South Africa I was living in. And then I started to accumulate a little bit of wealth for the next 6 years, which allowed me to invest in the stock market. Because all the money I'd previously been funding debt, which was roughly 60% of my salary at times, it varied, that 60% I saved and then put it into shares. And in 7 years, I suddenly had an investment portfolio. And I was getting dividends out of those because I invested in shares that paid dividends. And suddenly I started to create my own pension portfolio, if you want.
Right.
And now my properties are paid off, and some of them are paying rent to me, and I no longer have to pay it off.
Yeah.
So I can bring it in as income
Yeah.
for me to live.
Yeah.
And then my share portfolio is growing, and they're paying dividends, which vary.
Yeah.
And sometimes they don't pay dividends if they have a bad year. So it's not as, it's higher risk, which sometimes can go up and down. And then at 43, the income I had from property and dividends was equal to my salary. And then I went,
Now's the time.
bye-bye. So when I leapt over, there wasn't a massive amount of risk. My standard of living went down
Yeah.
because I was on half of what I was earning before. But now I was free.
Yeah.
And being free was more important than having a high standard of living.
Tell me something. What is it like when the morning after, when you're like, okay, I'm out of here, and then you wake up the next day, and it's like, now I don't necessarily have to work.
It sounds great, but actually it wasn't that easy. The first 2 years was difficult because I'd been trained all my life to get up at 6 and to be ready for work at 9, and then to have a lunch or a break, and then to finish at 5 if you want, and then come home. And when that pattern was taken away, I found it quite troubling. And I realized that I'd become trained almost like a monkey to follow a certain pattern. And I would say it took me 2 years to adjust, to relax, because there was almost a feeling of guilt.
Wow.
I should be going to work.
Yeah.
Oh, I was trained almost puritanical. If you don't work for it, you don't deserve it.
Right.
And this is the working class in me
Mentality.
that exists.
Yeah.
And it stuck with me for a couple of years. And so I don't think it was as nice as I dreamt it was going to be. But after I got through those 2 years, then the door of freedom opened. And I created a company, and then I created a family trust. And I started doing things and living a life that I could only dream of when I was a youngster.
Wow. So I mean, okay. So you started diversifying in the way you spend. I mean, like I actually had what I've been thinking about since our conversation last week was the squirrel. So I want you to tell me about the squirrel, like that type of mentality that you had as you were developing this mindset of or developing the habits.
All right. So the part of me which is the darker side is fear. The fear that I didn't know what I was doing, because there is no one that I know that could advise me.
Wow.
There was no pattern, and because I feared poverty quite a lot, it felt to me logical that whenever I earned a little bit of money, I put something aside. And if you keep on putting something aside, I'm even doing it today. I'm still saving for my retirement at 75. I've still got a provident fund that I put in some money every month from my business. And I haven't lost that habit. I don't need it. In fact, I think I look in the mirror sometimes and realise that I'm being a bit stupid, paranoid, right? Good word. But I can't help it. I feel comfortable just putting it aside. So, for instance, the pension I get from UK was 35 years of contributions. And when I came to this country, most people stopped their contributions, but I found a way to keep them going. If you look at investments over a period of time, it normally takes 30 to 40 years to earn enough back to survive on your own. So a pension is not created overnight. It actually takes decades of contributions of somewhere between 5 and 20% of your income. And so to become totally free, you have to be in the habit of just putting that money aside. And I don't think a year went by where I didn't do that. And I've done it from the age of 18, and I'm 67 now, and I'm still doing it. So the squirrel in me is alive and well.
That's awesome.
And I'll probably carry on doing it. I can see that I'll hit 75 when I'm finally going to retire 100%. And I'll just about guarantee I'll go, well, maybe I should just put a little bit aside just in case I have an accident and I get into hospital.
Right.
So that squirrel is very powerful because it's compound interest working to your advantage.
Right. I mean, those are the habits. Those are like the core habits. I mean, my life is entrenched in sport, has always been, and it wasn't really about the one competition that I won. It was about the consistency of having to go to training every single day.
Right.
For years.
Yeah.
To accumulate. And then, and I love the way earlier you said that you were putting money away, or you started to, you were putting money away to invest in, to start up your portfolio. And then 7 years later, suddenly, it's like, the way that you said that just made me think, like, yes, when you look back, like, oh my goodness. But in the process, we get so sort of stuck in either the monotony or the boringness of not having the thing that we really, really want, and then we just divert. And
well, I think there's a self-analysis that you have to do. So I also played sport. I played rugby, but rugby's in my era was a very amateur game. You certainly didn't make anything out of it. But you're right. The harder I trained, the higher the teams I used to end up with. Until age caught up with me. But when I looked in the mirror and analysed myself, from a very early age, I realised that I wasn't a genius. I used to get to the top of the class because I worked 10 to 15% harder than most people, and sometimes a lot harder than other people. So I never thought I would come up with a brilliant idea that would make me a multi-billionaire. And I don't know how many people believe that they can do that, but I believed I couldn't. So when I analysed myself, I realised if I'm going to have a good life and live the life I want to live, then I have to be smart. And smart means squirreling away until compound interest works in your advantage, because compound interest is very, very powerful. And when you're in debt, compound interest is working against you because you're paying for other people's profit. But when you can buy something for cash, you can negotiate a discount. So buying a car for cash means that you say, how much will you give me off if I give you cash? And buying a car doesn't have to be a new car. You can buy a 2 or 3 year old car, which is already 40% discounted to the purchase price. So there's ways of existing and living a very good life where if you've got cash, all sorts of compounding comes to your advantage. And I started to live that life in my 40s, but when I was 18, I dreamed about it. So it was decades before it happened.
Shane, talking about the car story, you told me about. Would you just talk about that story of how you eventually bought that Merc?
Oh, right. So when I was working in this corporate world, status was quite important. How big your desk was, how big your office was, what sort of car you drove.
Still is.
Was quite important. And at that time, the level I was at, most people had a Mercedes 200, very nice car. And the chairman of the company had a Mercedes 560 SEC, which was arguably the best sports coupe in the world at the time. Because I'd saved up, I now had cash to buy a Mercedes 200. But the price of the Mercedes 200 was covered, but I went out in the market and discovered that there were second-hand 560s that were only 2 or 3 years old that they couldn't sell because no one buys a second-hand 560. So their price dropped something like 60%. And it only had a small number of miles on for an engine of that size. So it had about 40,000 kilometers on it, which on a 560 engine is nothing. So I bought that for the same price. So when I drove into work, having had the oldest car of all my guys, it was a Ford Gear or something like that, and I drove in with a Mercedes 560. And that made some of the guys around me quite jealous.
and I mean, we're also talking about it. I love that story because we were talking about, and I see it often. I mean, we're in Sandton here, and people here live extravagant lives.
Right.
We're talking about you getting out. I think once you were talking about a BMW or something, and like, this is a beautiful car you have, yeah. And then you got out to, I don't know what you were driving. I think it was either the Volvo or something. You got out of that, you're like, that's a beautiful car, you know, and carry on. But you know that's debt. You know, that this man is probably stuck in a mountain of debt.
Right.
And
so the problem with debt for cars is it's compounding negative, because you tend to pay a higher interest rate and you don't get any discount when you buy the car. And at the end of the cycle, they normally come back and offer you a newer car, right, and start the cycle again. So that's entrapping you. And cars and salesmen do that as part of their living in order for them to earn their salary. And there's nothing wrong with that. But you can change that cycle by saying no and allowing your car to last longer and paying your car off. And then maybe the first time you buy a new car, you're not as lucky as me. You can't buy the bigger range car at a cheaper price, but you might buy a smaller car. But the next time, you'll get to a higher and higher level. But that takes you cycles. And cycles happen in decades, not in months. And if you're not patient, then you never end up becoming free. And I actually believe that some of my colleagues have died early, right, because they didn't have the financial wherewithal to take care of themselves. And the brain is very powerful. And if you want a long, successful life, you need a good financial background to help you. So you can get the best treatment at hospital, you can make sure that you eat the best food, and you can live a long and successful life. And that requires money. Poverty will bring premature death for lots of reasons. So wealth, financial wealth, can bring you wealth in your health as well. They're linked, I believe.
100%. 100%. I mean, just as you're talking, I'm thinking of what most people perceive as lots of money. And it comes down to the big house and the big cars and the trips overseas. Then that's just all money going out. And it's like, I work, I slave. I'm trapped in that whole system. So I think as a final sort of a idea, like, what would you say because there were a couple of things in what you said, and I think the first part is like know yourself. What drives you and what motivates you to really stick it out and grow your financial brain, or to find out what to take those resources you have and start to build. Do you have any tips on that?
Well, analysing yourself is quite hard because we tend to look at ourselves in a distorted way. We either underestimate ourselves or we overestimate ourselves.
Right.
And sometimes it's bravado. But if we're very truthful with ourselves, we know what we are. And sometimes we might need help and someone pointing out. So a good friend will say, actually, you're not good at that. I've met some brilliant salesmen, and I see that they've got a skill that I haven't got. And I admire them for having that skill. But not many of them use it to their advantage. They use it to the advantage of the companies they work for. And they often, the salesmen I've met, often get themselves caught up in debt. And once they leave the company and no longer earn the commission, their life that they've got behind them, after all that wealth they've created for other people, is nothing for themselves. Now that to me seems such a waste. It's like a great skilled person in the world ending up in poverty. It seems to me crazy, but it happens. And it's because that person never had a chance to have someone to manage their finances themselves. They needed help. So some people need to work out, we all need to work out, what our real truth about ourselves is. And if you need help in doing that, then get people to help you. The Mankind Project, for instance, is one of those areas where you can get people to be much more authentic and truthful. And you learn to be truthful about yourself. So I think it's a journey, because I still believe I'm learning about myself now. And I'm not perfect, and I'm flawed, and I know I'll make mistakes. And once you realise that you've got that in you, then you can compensate and cover yourself in a way that allows you to live a good life. And we're only on here for a short period, 70. Although I'm hoping to last a little bit longer than that.
Yeah.
and you want to have some enjoyment during that life. Even going on holiday overseas, there are ways that you can have a holiday in Mauritius at a discount. You don't have to end up going in the hotel.
100%.
You can go and via Airbnb, and this is what I did recently, and rent out a studio at a price that is quite reasonable.
Yeah.
And you're just round the corner from the 5-star hotels, which you can enjoy.
Yeah.
And the beach and the island is beautiful. And you can get it at 10% of the price that people pay for.
And I think that's so funny, because I mean, here you are, you're financially free, and you got enough money to go to the 5-star hotel, but you're like, go to the Airbnb, get a studio hotel, we'll be around the corner from the 5-star hotel, we'll still enjoy it, And I know, because I know a lot of people, they make a lot of money, and it goes out just as quickly.
Correct. And
in the same way, I just wanted to also make that point. It's regardless of the amount of money you make. It's about the way that you actually, it's whether you keep that money and the flow of it and how you use it to generate income. And
well, money's if you respect money, if you've made money over a long period of time, then you don't let go of it without a struggle. Respect money. Money has an energy. And if you know you can make something last a little bit longer, or you can get something at a better price, then negotiate that and make it happen. It's actually fun. I mean, I was in Mauritius for nearly 3 months, and it cost me less than 2 weeks that some people spend there. And that gave me some satisfaction. And I certainly enjoyed being on the island for 3 months.
Yeah, sure.
Because I had lots of scuba diving and exploring, and I could enjoy the place at peace.
Wow. So okay, so the mindset is there. So that really understanding what is your who you are and what you want to achieve in your life. And I think that I love the words that you use in terms of you wanted financial independence or independence and what that meant to you. Because when you said independence, I thought to myself, look, independence in my brain was like more like living on my own, self-sufficient. And that could be in a shitload of debt, you know. So what clarity and what amount of clarity did you put inside your mind in terms of what independence meant to you?
Okay, independence meant I didn't have to work for anyone else. Independence means that I can stay in bed 7 days a week and still survive. So the independence does mean that you have to have a certain amount of wealth. Right? But I could happily live in one room. Right? It wouldn't be a problem for me. I would rather live in one room and be independent than live in a mansion and be dependent on other people. So you can scale your life depending on how successful you are and become independent. But independent also means that you've got freedom to eat the food that you want, freedom to go and visit places that you'd like to visit, to go on holiday for as many months of the year that you want. So independence means that you're not caught up in the capitalist system that exists. You can actually leave it behind you. You still have to obey the rules, you still have to pay the taxes, you still have to pay the rates, you still have to do the right thing by the society that you live in. But if you're independent of it, it means you choose where to put your energy. So these days I can't choose to play rugby because I'm too old, but I can choose to go to the gym, or I can choose to scuba dive, or I can choose to be part of a Mankind project, or I can choose to be doing this interview with you. There's the choices that I have, and that's freedom.
Yeah.
And freedom, wow, freedom is fantastic, because this world can catch you if you're not careful.
I mean, you're making me think freedom is not free. And I mean, like, at the end of the day, it's like, just because I'm now in this new South African world, I'm not necessarily free. I have to literally earn my freedom in a different capacity. You know, and even in that state, I mean, you alluded to it in terms of the continuous work you're doing on yourself, because you're growing and you're changing. You're free financially, but mentally, continuously unraveling that onion.
Yes. Yeah. And also I've got the time to take care of my health.
Yeah.
So I enjoy going to the gym, but I can go to the gym for an hour and a half, 2 hours, because I'm not being chased by an employer who expects me back at work.
Yeah, 1 o'clock in the afternoon. You just
yeah, which is fantastic.
Yeah.
So my life, I've got to say, my life is very blessed. I'm a very lucky man, and I know I've made some of that luck over many decades, but I'm very happy I did. And the other thing to realise is that when you do investments, you make mistakes. So not every investment is 100% correct. Warren Buffett makes mistakes,
100%.
but he also makes good decisions. And he makes more good decisions than bad decisions, and that's why he's managed to become wealthy. So,
Stu, and I think this is one of the sort of last sort of points I wanted to just go towards, and it was really just making those distinctions along as you're going along. And I love the fact that you mentioned, like, it was not perfect. You had to make mistakes going through learning. I've noticed myself. If when I'm under, like, oh geez, I need to invest or whatever, I would just go ahead and make a stupid investment by putting more than I need to into an investment and end up either losing it all, because especially now you get these sort of, I call them snake oil salesmen, but they are just guys that they'll give you a call from overseas and say, hey, I'm from this stock market brokerage, and you know, you can do a good deal, now's the time, get in, buy. And you get involved in that stuff and you lose all your money in an instant. And throughout this whole thing, we spoke about decades, getting involved for decades and taking that time to learn move. And I mean, how would someone get themselves some education? Where would you suggest to get started, to get moving, and really just taking stock of your life and taking advantage? Just changing the trajectory of a financial life.
So that's interesting, because when I got into stocks and shares, I made a decision in my 30s to try and understand stocks and shares. And I didn't really understand them. I was attending presentations which were given by experts, and it made me curious. So I decided to stop reading the sports page first and to start to read the business page. And I forced myself originally, because it looked pretty boring and I didn't understand what was being said. But I forced myself to move away from sports and to move into the business page. I still enjoy reading the sports page, but now I read the business page first and the sports page second, because my interest has now moved into business. But there's no doubt I've made those mistakes of buying investments because they were the flavour of the month. And I've made mistakes and lost money. But I always knew when I was being speculative. So what happened was, because of my caution, I would put a small amount into the speculative shares. But my big investments were in what I would call the steady eddies. And they've, funnily enough, given me the best returns over 20 to 30 years. So my analogy would be the tortoise beats the hare. Right? The gradual. The management know what they're doing. They tell a true story. Sometimes the dividends aren't increased, but they generally are increased every year by a small percentage. And continuously over decades, the dividends have increased higher and higher. And some of my best investments have been done that way. So now I get dividends that are equal to my original total investment.
Wow.
But that is 15, 17 years later after the investment. So it didn't happen overnight. But the mistakes, salesmen we all fall for some brilliant salesmen. I mean, the politicians that are involved in the world today are there because they're brilliant salesmen. The guy who makes the biggest commission is because he's a brilliant salesman. And sometimes they sell you what is good for them and their company and not good for you. And it takes experience to work out which ones work. But even with experience, you make mistakes. So don't beat yourself up if you tried something and it didn't go right. That doesn't mean that you can't do it better next time.
100%. Oh, cool. Thank you so much, Stuart. I think that was insightful. I'm looking forward to everybody who watches this, everybody who sees this, who hears this online. Let me know your thoughts. Perhaps if you have any more questions, would love to. I'll get them to Stu. Maybe you can answer them if you want. I really appreciated your time, Stu. That was really insightful. You make me, every time we connect, you make me think a bit deeper. So appreciate your time.
It's a pleasure. I enjoyed it. Thanks very much.
Cool.